With the trilogy on its path to completion, the hype around the Metroid Prime series was strong, but not just for Metroid Prime 3, but also the new dual-screen handheld known as the Nintendo DS. The producer of the Metroid Prime series, Kensuke Tanabe, developed an idea for a Metroid Prime game for this very platform that would greatly take advantage of its hardware, from its 3D graphics to its touchscreen mechanics. However, with Retro Studios already hard at work on Metroid Prime 2 and soon Metroid Prime 3, the Golden Texas-based team couldn't afford to spend time on this handheld Prime game as well. As such, Tanabe, wanting to further influence the series with a more Western presentation, style, and ideals, contacted Nintendo's other Western studio, Nintendo Software Technology, or NST for short, to produce the Nintendo DS's killer app, Metroid Prime Hunters. Through a variety of innovations for the series, controversies, and even ideas that never made it in, today we'll be looking at the history and beta unused content of Metroid Prime Hunters. If you enjoyed this video, please hit the subscribe button and hit the notification bell too to further support us and keep creating new videos. The new developers of Metroid Prime Hunters, NST, already had a resume of Nintendo games they had worked on prior, and even worked on Ridge Racer DS just prior. Therefore, being experienced with the handheld and a Nintendo Western studio, Tanabe saw promise in them developing this game. Working together with NST, Tanabe and the team came up with a story that would be a midquel that would take place in between Metroid Prime 1 and 2, with Samus having her suit from Metroid Prime 2, but the gunship from Metroid Prime 1 to show a transition. But one major feature Tanabe wanted was an expansion to the Metroid Prime 2 multiplayer, which was presented as more of a bonus, but wanted to greatly expand upon it while still preserving the strong single-player mode. Therefore, the obvious inclusion of additional bounty hunters came into play. The idea of both a robust multiplayer mode and several bounty hunters was already an idea the series considered for the scrapped pitch of Metroid Prime 2. Being a producer for that game, this inspiration may have very well even stemmed from that scrapped pitch. In fact, the inclusion of bounty hunters may have not just even been for on-foot combat between them, but even dogfights with their respective gunships as seen in this concept art. Note that despite Retro Studios being rather busy, concept art such as these were still drawn up by them to get the style and look of the game to stay consistent with the rest of the 3D series. One of which is this one depicting a battle between gunships with Samus blowing up someone's gunship. Considering the fact that the game even has Samus hopping between many worlds, it's possible this mode could have also been used as an interlude while traveling between the planets, much as how one uses a gummy ship in Kingdom Hearts when going between worlds. In fact, the bounty hunters were also supposed to each have their own entrance themes. Normally, when you encounter them in-game, they have cutscenes that play to introduce them. It is possible these would have played over it. Have a listen. The game was being developed in the early days of the Nintendo DS, thus development kits weren't finalized, and many developers had to readjust launch or close to launch games to match these final specifications. Metroid Prime Hunters was one of these games, in fact. For one, the bounty hunters all had models made at a much higher polygon count and higher res textures too, each one at around a 500 polygon count. Clearly not as high as the one from the GameCube games, but had to be downscaled just to function properly on the DS. But on top of that, each bounty hunter had much smoother animations too that had to be cut down to keep the DS's processing power at a stable rate. Thus, we instead got these much choppier animations in exchange. But it's not even limited to bounty hunters, but even several environments that, while looking rather similar to the final game, feature full anti-aliasing with textures blended, something the final Nintendo DS couldn't do. While a number of ideas were being tossed around, some altered designs and cut enemies did come into the mix as usual. The first of which is this enemy that looks straight out of Half-Life, which is fitting with the additional push of Western ideals. Likely would have been stuck and hit on the ceiling and then would have jumped down and attacked Samus. I imagine its mouth would have been a major weak point. Found within the data of the game exist different textures for the mini-boss Guardian. Being normally a rather plain looking droid-like villain, the three that you faced each had additional textures. The first one had 4 other textures that looked to each represent an element: ice, electro, magma, and neutral tone. The second and third each having one additional one, being an even earlier texture of electro and magma. This all may indicate that the Guardians were supposed to use elemental weapons, but were dropped during development. And found within the demo of the game called First Hunt are early versions of the Jump Pad Ray and War Wasp. The Ray being more of a dull tone, while the Wasp being a whole other model and color scheme too. The main antagonist of the game, Gorilla, had the beta design too. This one having a more realistic design to it with a rustic look. On top of that, an unused model of Gorilla opening and closing its guns exists too, but it's detached from the rest of its body. And of course, a really weird kind of Metroid referred to as a Temroid is in the data too, looking like a bushy Metroid. Now there are also regular Metroids, Zoomers, and also an enemy called the Xenomorph that was only in the First Hunt demo, but we'll return to that topic shortly. Meanwhile, single player mode had a few unused content. As we know, doors in Metroid may be color coded to open with a specific beam or missile. Hunters was no different, but this time there was a different door design too for certain beams, a thin and regular door. Regular door colors exist for every beam except the shock coil and the battle hammer, while the thin door color exists only for the battle hammer and one where any beam would work on it. However, the data has a full set of 8 colors per door, corresponding to each of the 8 beams, but many of which simply go unused and sit in the data. On top of that, a number of cut objects that were to appear in maps were found in the data, including moving blocks, an unused electrical field, static models of the enemy Psycho Bit and Voldrum with and without their gun, and a number of objects corresponding to environmental designs of many different areas, including a plain generic set too, from scanners, switches, jump pads, and just static background decoration. There is also an early version of the brain chamber found in the Vito area. The demo for the game also had doors that much more resembled the ones found in Metroid Prime. And for good measure, there's even an object for obtaining the bomb, which goes unused as Samus starts out with it from the get-go. As development ran, soon came E3 2004, an E3 that was considered a massive hit for Nintendo for premiering everything from the Nintendo DS, The Legend of Zelda Twilight Princess, Reggie himself, Metroid Prime 2, and of course, Metroid Prime Hunters itself. Metroid Prime Hunters took the spotlight for DS games by showcasing how capable the Nintendo DS was in handling a game that looked and played so similarly to the GameCube Metroid Prime games, even winning IGN's Best Nintendo DS Game of the Show award. With the game looking like the Nintendo DS's killer app, the Nintendo DS released on November 21st, 2004, packed with a demo of the game, titled as Metroid Prime Hunters First Hunt. It was essentially an updated version of the E3 build that included 3 short single-player modes, a trailer, and a multiplayer section. The single-player mode included one called the Regulator, which was a timed race to the end of the level where Samus even fought enemies including Metroid look-alike enemies called Xenomorphs, and Zoomers, all of which never made it into the final game, but it's hard to say if they were just intended for a demo here, which is why I can't say if these are considered cut enemies. And it ends with Samus facing off against a green clone of herself to a remix of the Meta Ridley theme. The next mode is called Survivor. As the name states, it's a survival mode where Samus fights the 3 same normal enemies again and again in an endless wave until she dies. and the last mode being Morph Ball, where one is required to guide Samus as a Morph Ball through tunnels and collect blue energy capsules. And this demo card itself contained a number of early features, including a different take on several of Samus's weapons and abilities. The Power Beam was a lot stronger for one, being the strength of the Charge Beam in this case. However, it originally was going to have limited ammo, a first for the series if this was done, as Metroid Prime 2 only had that for only the other beam weapons, while the Power Beam still didn't need ammo. However, instead of just running out, Samus would just shoot at a slower pace until she got more ammo. But as we know, all of the other weapons in the game do have limited ammo, including the missiles. But in the demo, the missiles shared ammunition with the other weapons instead of having their own set. Now a truly unused weapon is the Electro Lob, fully functional and is a cross between the Volt Driver and the Battle Hammer weapons from the final game, firing in an arc like the Battle Hammer while scrambling the vision of the opponents like the Volt Driver. However, both the missiles and the Electro Lob can be upgraded here by simply grabbing 2 expansion packs in order for them to become the charged varieties. The charged missiles will do massive damage, but at a cost of 15 universal ammo. The charged Electro Lob doesn't cause more damage, but can now shoot in a straight line instead of an arc, at the cost of 10 universal ammo. Now bombs are slightly different, as you can only lay 3 at a time and have to wait a short period before laying 3 more. Also, they were a lot weaker in this version before they were buffed for the retail version. And of course, there is also a double damage power-up in single player mode, while they only appear in the multiplayer mode of the final game. And this demo was loved by those who played it on their fresh new handheld and got a taste of both the features of the system and what this game can offer once released. Game Radar even stated that it's a fine showcase for demonstrating what the Nintendo DS hardware is capable of. However, rolling to E3 2005, the game was revealed not to have online play despite the Nintendo DS having online capabilities. It received negative feedback this time, as online play was considered essential for multiplayer modes of shooting games at this point, and not having it was just not the norm anymore. Producer Tanabe, however, did state that because of the timing of the game's release, they just simply didn't have time to build the infrastructure to make the online play work. And so, after much negative feedback, in August 2005, Nintendo announced that they would delay the game in order to make online multiplayer a reality. And so the major focus on multiplayer and specifically online play became apparent as focus shifted from single player to multiplayer. However, single player still received polish too, including its frame rate and its graphics, such as the addition of reflections on the Morph Ball. Multiplayer overall was being designed to take advantage of the DS's capabilities, including the handheld color palette and what would look best on its screens. As well, for a number of the levels, they were designed with a dual purpose, with many originally designed for multiplayer, but also being used in single player, and vice versa too. But speaking of those maps, the final game's data shows the evolution of some of these multiplayer maps, as 6 earlier versions of the multiplayer maps were discovered in the data. These were very unfinished in these old states. All of them lacked a lot of environmental textures and details that would give them their uniqueness. As well, there were no objects in any of them to even be properly navigated through, let alone the shape of some of these levels weren't complete either. However, the level Headshot even had an additional cut map found within the game's demo that looked even more bare, with just a few circular platforms around. With the game nearing release, marketing was a key, of course. Rather than going the viral marketing route that they did with Metroid Prime 2, this time they hired director Len Wiseman of the Underworld series to make an eye-catching commercial featuring a gravedigger burying bounty hunters in a futuristic setting, giving a look at how high the kill count would be in the game. Meanwhile, in Europe, a tournament was being held for the game in a show of its robust multiplayer mode as a partnership between Nintendo and HMV, with the winner being given an all-expense-paid trip to meet the developers of the game at NST in Seattle. Granted, this tournament was set after the game released. But with that, the game was released on March 20th, 2006. While the series was considered rather niche then, it sold over 410,000 units in North America, which would be less than Metroid Prime 2's, but it was also on a handheld still early in its life, featuring a genre not so popular on said handheld either. But otherwise, it was another critical success for this series, even though it wasn't done by Retro Studios. However, the scores were mostly 8s and 9s rather than the 9s and 10s like the first two. The reason for this docking in points came down to two reasons. The first being that the controls were cramp-inducing and had a high learning curve. Made sense as it was a handheld trying to emulate a first-person shooter. But the major complaint came down to how the single-player mode was rather lacking next to the first two games, as levels were contrived and predictable, and too formulaic with repeated boss fights. While a real reason wasn't given as to why this single-player mode was lacking, it is believed that it is because the team focused much more on the multiplayer mode, which was considered rather stellar, and the online mode was even considered as a smooth experience. And while most agreed it was a strong addition to the series, it even won numerous awards, including the Editor's Choice Award and Best DS Game of 2006 by IGN. And while this kept Metroid fans busy with hours of fun single-player action and stellar online play with friends and the world, the trilogy was boiling down to its grand finale over at Retro Studios with Nintendo's new console, the Wii, on the horizon. That game being Metroid Prime 3. A game I plan to cover, so hit that subscribe button for I'll plan to be back with more Metroid and other games history and cut content. Hit the like button and also check out the previous video on the history and cut content of Metroid Prime 2 over here, with its over-the-top marketing and even an alternate ending. So everyone, thank you for watching.